Arbin, Dreda, and Alir were ordinary names in ordinary villages, but behind those names hid a network of greed, deception, and a criminal empire that exploited hope itself. This is the story of lives stolen, secrets buried, and the ruthless gangs that thrived in the shadows of Albania. In the late 1990s, the quiet coasts of southern Europe began to see strange movements along the shoreline. At first, it was easy to mistake the small boats as fishermen returning home, or families seeking a better life. But hidden among the crowds were men who carried something darker, a careful, calculated ambition. They were organized, patient, and invisible in plain sight. These newcomers did not arrive with violence or threats. They arrived with clean clothes, empty smiles, and documents that seemed official. Their real work began quietly, blending into the rhythm of the cities they entered, observing, learning, and mapping everything around them. By day, they appeared ordinary, walking through crowded markets, studying street layouts, and noting the locations of police stations. By night, they whispered plans in rented apartments, plotting routes and escape plans, memorizing patrol patterns, and exchanging information with contacts across borders. The operation was precise, like a machine running in the shadows, and the people who would later fall victim to it had no idea it existed. The gangs understood the value of patience. They did not rush. They waited for the right moment, the right person, and the right opportunity. What made their arrival almost undetectable was the way they moved through society. They offered small, seemingly harmless favors. A job lead here, a ride there, a promise of safety or opportunity. They made connections with locals, building trust with a smile, a handshake, and subtle gestures that suggested goodwill. These gestures were calculated. Each connection was a thread in a growing web, stretching further with every day. People often noticed the newcomers, but dismissed them as temporary visitors, unaware that the city itself was being quietly mapped and claimed. The gangs did not immediately deal in drugs, weapons, or violence. Their trade was far more insidious. It was human lives. They studied poverty, desperation, and hope, and they discovered the perfect market for exploitation. Villages far from city lights became their hunting grounds, where families clung to promises of escape and a better future. Each promise was a trap, wrapped in opportunity. The people who believed in these offers were never fully aware that each document, each contract, and each handshake was part of a plan designed to control them. By the time the local authorities noticed something unusual, it was often too late. Safe houses were already established, and networks of couriers and operatives had been quietly formed. Routes across borders had been tested and perfected, ensuring that even if one path was blocked, another would immediately take its place. The gangs were not seen as criminals at first. They were shadows in the background, almost invisible, blending seamlessly into the flow of daily life. Even in cities bustling with people, the gang's presence remained unnoticed because they understood human psychology. They observed patterns of trust, fear, and hope, exploiting them with precision. Families sent children away with dreams of work and education, unaware that those dreams were being hijacked. Adults sought safety and opportunity, unaware that their movements were being tracked and their destinies rewritten. The silent arrival of these men marked the beginning of a long-hidden war over human lives. They did not need to raise their voices or brandish weapons. Their power lay in subtlety, patience, and careful observation. By the time anyone realized the danger, the networks were already in place, and a business built on fear and deception had begun to grow, quietly, methodically, and invisibly. The cities appeared calm on the surface, but beneath the streets and within the shadows, a new kind of criminal empire was being built, one that would later shock nations and reveal the dark potential of exploitation disguised as opportunity. The gangs quickly learned that lies were far cheaper and more effective than force. They discovered that hope could be manipulated more powerfully than fear. In villages across Albania, whispers of work abroad traveled faster than any official notice or news report. Modeling contracts, restaurant jobs, cleaning positions, each promise was tailored to the desires of the person being targeted. The gangs observed the people closely, noting the young women who dreamed of a glamorous career, the men desperate to send money back to their families, and the families themselves hungry for stability. Every promise sounded plausible, carefully designed to match the hopes of its target. Travel documents were arranged as if by magic. Passports, visas, and letters of recommendation were produced with meticulous care. Even when authorities checked, the paperwork appeared legitimate. Some victims were told they owed money for the travel costs, creating invisible chains before they even crossed the border. It was a clever trap. Debts that seemed temporary became permanent, enforced by threats and manipulation once the victims were in foreign countries. Every step of the journey had been planned in advance, and the victims had no idea they were walking into a web they could not easily escape. Once borders were crossed, the illusion shattered. Phones were confiscated, names were changed, and the once friendly faces of recruiters became strangers. Victims quickly understood that their freedom had been traded for a debt they could not pay. The gangs had learned to operate with subtlety and efficiency, ensuring that coercion came not through violence alone, but through control of movement, money, and communication. Families searching for their loved ones were often told false information or simply blocked from learning the truth. The system was airtight, designed to crush hope while extracting profit. The gangs also used psychological manipulation to maintain control. Victims were isolated from communities, moved between apartments and safe houses, and constantly monitored. Any attempt to escape was met with threats or intimidation, but rarely with overt violence at first. The fear was woven into daily life, invisible yet omnipresent. The victims were conditioned to believe that help did not exist, that authorities could not or would not intervene, and that the only way to survive was to comply. The gangs understood that a mind controlled by fear and debt was far easier to manage than one subdued by brute force. The promise trap extended beyond the immediate victims. Families back home were also manipulated. The gangs would contact relatives with fabricated stories of progress or demands for more money. Each communication reinforced the control, convincing families that the situation was temporary, that cooperation was necessary, and that resistance would only worsen the circumstances. By controlling information, the gangs created a network of compliance stretching across borders, a silent force that moved like a shadow over entire communities. This approach made the operation almost invisible to authorities and the public. The gangs avoided attention by never acting in overtly criminal ways in public. They did not need to confront anyone on the street. Their power came from the invisible threads they tied around lives, from the debts, lies, and hopes they manipulated. By the time the victims realized the extent of their captivity, the networks were already strong, the roots perfected, and the people at the top untouchable. The promise trap was complete. The victims were trapped, the families deceived, and the gangs free to expand their reach, confident that the next group of hopeful travelers would fall into the same carefully constructed web. Safe houses began appearing in the most ordinary of places: apartments above bakeries, small flats in quiet neighborhoods, even rooms rented in hotels where tourists rarely stayed long. To anyone passing by, these buildings seemed harmless, normal, even mundane. But inside, they were entirely different worlds, meticulously designed for control. Walls held secrets, and rooms were more than just spaces. They were instruments of surveillance and dominance. Each safe house was equipped with systems to monitor movement, track arrivals, and report unusual activity to higher levels in the gang hierarchy. Nothing was left to chance. Within these walls, strict schedules governed every aspect of life. Victims were woken early, fed, and moved according to plans that were not their own. Their movements were recorded, and their communications limited. Couriers and low-level operatives ensured that every transfer of money, every movement of people, and every message between the safe houses remained controlled. The gangs had perfected a system that worked like clockwork, and each victim's day was carefully orchestrated to maintain obedience. Sleep, meals, and work were all calculated to create a sense of normalcy while reinforcing dependence on the gang. The gangs also maintained a hierarchy that was both invisible and absolute. No single leader remained in one city for long. Leaders moved constantly, avoiding detection, while trusted lieutenants handled the daily operations of the network. This ensured that even if authorities managed to capture one part of the system, the overall network remained intact. Each level of the organization had a clear role. Some managed finances, others monitored victims, and others coordinated transportation and documentation. The network was resilient, like a spider's web, capable of withstanding disruption at multiple points without collapsing entirely. Money was the lifeblood of the operation, flowing upward in layers. Small payments were collected from victims, disguised as loans or fees, then funneled to middlemen before reaching the hands of the leaders. Each transaction was calculated to avoid attention, using informal channels, coded messages, and front businesses that appeared legitimate. Cafes, laundries, and small shops became cover for money laundering, allowing the gangs to integrate illicit profits into the legal economy. Even when financial authorities tried to investigate, the money was buried beneath layers of seemingly innocuous transactions, invisible to outsiders. Control extended beyond physical spaces into psychological domination. Victims were isolated, moved from city to city, and prevented from forming connections outside the network. Fear, shame, and dependency ensured compliance without the need for overt violence at every turn. Victims quickly learned that any attempt to resist could result in punishment, increased debt, or further isolation. The gangs understood that a mind constrained by fear and manipulation was easier to control than one subdued by brute force. In addition, the gangs used public spaces strategically to reinforce their power. Apartments overlooked busy streets, allowing operatives to monitor activity without raising suspicion. Cars and couriers blended seamlessly with ordinary traffic, while coded signals communicated instructions between safe houses. Even police patrols were studied and mapped, so the gangs could operate openly yet remain unseen. Their presence was a paradox, highly active yet almost invisible. By mastering both physical and psychological spaces, the gangs created a system that seemed unbreakable. Cities appeared ordinary on the surface, but underneath, a network of control and exploitation thrived. Safe houses were more than shelters. They were instruments of domination, each carefully positioned and managed to extract obedience and profit. The operation had become a hidden empire, quietly expanding, carefully concealed, and terrifyingly efficient, proving that true power often thrives not through chaos, but through precision and invisibility. At the top of this hidden empire was a man whose name was whispered but rarely spoken aloud. Few had ever seen him in person, and those who had remembered only a shadowy figure, always moving, always distant. He never stayed in one country long enough for authorities to catch a glimpse. His life was a continuous journey through borders, cities, and safe routes, making him almost untouchable. Even among his own network, he remained a phantom, giving orders indirectly and trusting only intermediaries. His presence was felt everywhere, but he himself was nowhere. He invested in legitimate businesses that masked his illegal operations. Cafes, nightclubs, car washes, and small shops dotted the streets of multiple countries. To outsiders, these were normal establishments, places to drink coffee, enjoy music, or wash a car. But beneath the surface, they functioned as financial conduits, washing money from illicit activities and funneling it through the legal economy. These businesses were carefully chosen. They were ordinary enough not to attract suspicion, but profitable enough to sustain and expand the gang's reach. Each investment also served as a hub of information, where trusted lieutenants reported back on developments across the network. The man at the top was a master of invisibility. He avoided the flashy displays of power often associated with crime bosses. There were no grandiose mansions, no ostentatious cars, no visible security details. Instead, his power was quiet, built on fear, loyalty, and secrecy. He controlled the network like a chess player, moving pieces carefully, anticipating threats, and responding before problems could emerge. Even when authorities raided safe houses or arrested lower-level members, he remained untouched, as if the entire system protected him like a shield. Rumors about him created a sense of myth around his identity. Some said he was a former soldier. Others claimed he had connections to politicians and law enforcement, while a few believed he had allies in every country he operated in. These stories were carefully cultivated, whether intentionally or not, to instill fear and uncertainty. For the victims and operatives alike, the idea of the untouchable boss was a constant reminder that resistance was futile. The man's influence extended beyond physical presence. It existed in the way people acted, whispered, and obeyed. Even within the network, trust was fragile. Lieutenants knew that the boss could never be fully confronted or understood. Orders came indirectly, often through multiple intermediaries, ensuring deniability and security. This method also maintained loyalty. No one could claim personal authority over him, yet everyone depended on his vision to continue operating. Mistakes were punished not always through violence, but through sudden removal, reassignment, or exposure, reinforcing the hierarchy without ever revealing the leader's identity. Investigators who eventually traced the gang's operations found empty apartments, burned documents, and front businesses with clean books. Every lead ended in another layer of invisibility, making the top man seem untouchable. His strategy was a mixture of fear, clever investment, and absolute control over information. By the time authorities pieced together his influence, he was already long gone, moving to a new city, a new country, leaving behind only traces of the empire he commanded. The untouchable boss embodied the terrifying truth about organized crime. Power does not need to be visible to be absolute. He was not just a man. He was a system, a shadow over lives, a force that made an entire network of exploitation possible. His absence was as powerful as his presence, and his control extended far beyond the reach of law enforcement, shaping the fates of victims, the actions of subordinates, and the invisible rules of the criminal empire he ruled from the shadows. The seemingly routine arrest of a low-level driver in a small city changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. For years, the gangs had operated in a way that made them almost invisible, blending into ordinary life and leaving little trace behind. Authorities had suspected activity, but evidence was scarce, and the operation always seemed one step ahead. The driver, however, had been careless, a single mistake that would unravel part of the carefully constructed web. He was stopped for forged documents during a routine checkpoint, a minor offense on the surface, but what authorities discovered inside his vehicle was far more significant. Hidden inside a simple music player were digital files that had gone unnoticed for years. At first glance, it looked like ordinary data: music files, playlists, personal photos. But embedded within were records of financial transactions, coded messages, and detailed logs of movements across multiple countries. Payments, dates, and locations were all meticulously recorded. The files revealed a level of organization and reach that investigators had only suspected. For the first time, the gang network appeared vulnerable, and the untouchable empire that had seemed impenetrable now had a small crack in its armor. The information from the driver quickly became the foundation for a broader investigation. Investigators pieced together financial trails, tracing payments from victims through multiple intermediaries. Each lead uncovered a layer of the network that had previously been invisible. Safe houses, travel routes, and operatives were identified through a combination of digital evidence and old-fashioned legwork. The files were like a map of the gang's operations, showing not just the structure, but also the methodical precision with which every move had been executed. What made the discovery even more shocking was the scale of coordination. The records revealed synchronized movements across countries, planned well in advance, with contingency plans in case of arrest or exposure. The gang's ability to adapt and survive had always seemed almost instinctual, but now investigators saw it as a deliberate, calculated system. It was not chaos. It was an operation that functioned like a machine, each part working in perfect synchrony. The arrest of a single driver had unexpectedly exposed the inner workings of a vast criminal network. The files also contained information about individuals who had been considered untouchable within the network. Names of key lieutenants, payment schedules, and even coded references to the top boss were recorded, giving authorities clues to track higher levels of the operation. Witnesses who had previously been too scared to speak were now contacted under protection, and some began to provide corroborating evidence. The network, which had seemed so invulnerable, now appeared to have weak points that could be exploited. For the first time, the authorities realized that the gang's empire, while extensive and dangerous, was not infallible. Small mistakes, overlooked details, or careless actions could expose the entire system. The discovery transformed the investigation from a reactive effort into a strategic operation. It became clear that meticulous planning and patient work could dismantle even the most secretive criminal networks. The arrest of a single low-level driver, a seemingly insignificant event, had opened the door to understanding the full scale of the exploitation and control that the gangs had maintained for years. The fragile appearance of the network became a source of hope for victims and authorities alike. It proved that even the most carefully hidden operations could be uncovered with persistence, observation, and a little luck. The files inside a simple music player had turned the tide, revealing cracks in an empire that had once appeared untouchable, and setting the stage for a series of events that would challenge the power of the gangs like never before. As investigators followed the digital trail uncovered from the low-level driver, they uncovered a shocking and unexpected truth. A respected community mediator had been working secretly with the gangs. For years, this individual had cultivated an image of integrity, someone who helped families resolve disputes and supported local initiatives. He attended public events, spoke about crime prevention, and offered guidance to those in need. To the community, he was a pillar of trust, a figure whose word carried weight. Yet behind closed doors, he had been moving money, coordinating routes, and maintaining communication channels for the gangs, all while maintaining the perfect facade of a law-abiding citizen. The discovery stunned investigators. The mediator's role explained why certain operations had remained untouched for so long. He had been the invisible hand, guiding the gangs, controlling information, and ensuring that victims remained silent. Families who tried to intervene were subtly dissuaded, always met with plausible explanations, advice, or guidance that led nowhere. His influence was so extensive that even lower-level operatives deferred to his instructions, believing he was acting in the interest of the community rather than the criminal network. Evidence showed that he had been deeply involved in the movement of funds between safe houses and operatives. Payments collected from victims were disguised as charitable donations, community fees, or business expenses. Accounts were opened under his name or the names of close associates, creating layers of legitimacy that shielded the gangs from financial scrutiny. The mediator's knowledge of legal systems, municipal records, and local authorities gave the network an added advantage, allowing them to operate in plain sight while appearing completely lawful. The betrayal went even further. Investigators discovered that he had deliberately misled authorities during earlier inquiries. Requests for information were subtly delayed. Witnesses were directed away from providing testimony, and evidence was minimized in his presence. The man who had once been relied upon as a trusted guide had become one of the most dangerous components of the operation. His actions prolonged the suffering of victims, allowing the gang to maintain control and expand its reach across cities and borders. When his involvement came to light, the psychological impact on the community was profound. People struggled to reconcile the image of a trustworthy mediator with the reality of someone complicit in crimes that had devastated lives. Families felt betrayed, and victims realized that the manipulation they had endured had been orchestrated at multiple levels, not just by distant gang leaders, but by someone they had trusted implicitly. The betrayal demonstrated the depth of the network's reach and highlighted the way organized crime could infiltrate ordinary, trusted institutions. Authorities realized that to dismantle the network, they would need to expose not only the gang members, but also those who operated behind the scenes, manipulating perceptions and controlling information. The mediator's exposure became a turning point. It showed that the operation was not invulnerable, and that even the most trusted figures could be brought to account. Yet it also served as a chilling reminder of the subtlety of criminal networks. Sometimes the most dangerous threats are not those who are visible, but those who hide behind the trust and confidence of a community. This revelation shifted the investigation from simply tracking movements and financial flows to understanding the psychological and social architecture that allowed the gangs to survive. The betrayal emphasized the need to look beyond the obvious, to question authority, and to examine the invisible threads connecting crime to everyday life. The gangs had relied on silence and trust, but now, with one insider exposed, the carefully maintained balance of fear and obedience began to crack, revealing vulnerabilities that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The night of the raids began long before dawn, under the cover of darkness that blanketed the streets. Coordinated teams moved through multiple cities across Europe, guided by the intelligence gathered from the digital files and insider revelations. Each unit had a precise role. Some were tasked with securing safe houses, others with seizing records, while specialized teams focused on financial accounts and communication networks. The scale of the operation was immense, requiring careful timing, coordination, and secrecy. One mistake could tip off the network and allow key players to vanish. In the first wave, doors were broken, alarms were silenced, and operatives swept through apartments that had once seemed ordinary. Investigators found encrypted phones, ledgers filled with payments and debts, and even handwritten notes tracking the movements of victims. The safe houses that had once been invisible nodes of control were exposed, revealing the methods by which the gangs had maintained dominance. Each raid brought the authorities closer to understanding the full scope of the network, but it also revealed the human cost. Victims who had lived under constant fear were confronted with the reality of freedom for the first time, often overwhelmed by emotions and trauma that had built over years. As the raids unfolded, several high-ranking leaders were apprehended within hours. Their capture was a shock to the network, which had relied on their ability to move quickly and stay ahead of law enforcement. These arrests sent ripples through the gang, creating confusion, fear, and a temporary breakdown in communication. Without the leaders to issue instructions, operatives at lower levels struggled to maintain the system, and some attempted to flee, only to be intercepted by authorities. For the first time, the gang's perceived invincibility began to crumble under the weight of coordinated, methodical enforcement. Yet despite the massive operation, one name remained absent: the untouchable boss. Investigators found only empty apartments, burned documents, and traces of hurried departures. Every lead that had promised to reveal his location ended in a dead end. The absence of the top figure created both frustration and a chilling realization. Even with the arrest of many key members, the architect of the empire remained free, continuing to control from the shadows. The raids had dismantled much of the visible structure, but the ultimate mastermind remained a phantom, untouchable and untamed. The impact of the raids extended beyond law enforcement. Public awareness of the gang's operations increased, bringing long-hidden crimes into the open. Victims began to share their stories, shedding light on the scope of exploitation and the calculated methods used by the gangs. Communities that had once ignored rumors were forced to confront the reality that criminal networks had been operating in plain sight. The raids became a symbol of law enforcement capability and persistence, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated operations could be disrupted with intelligence, patience, and coordination. The night of collapse marked a turning point in the battle against the gang network. While significant progress had been made, the lingering presence of the untouchable boss served as a reminder of the limits of enforcement. The arrests showed that the network was vulnerable, yet the empire's roots ran deep. The raids dismantled operations temporarily, but the adaptability of the gang meant that new leaders could emerge, and new methods of exploitation could develop. By dawn, streets were quiet again, but the consequences of the night were felt across cities. Evidence was collected, victims were taken into protective custody, and investigators began analyzing the vast amounts of information recovered. The raids were both a victory and a warning. Even the most carefully hidden networks could be exposed, but the battle against exploitation was far from over. The collapse had begun, but it was only the first step in a long, complex struggle to dismantle an empire that had thrived on secrecy, control, and fear. Years after the raids, the case files were officially closed, and courts had handed down convictions. Many of the gang members caught in the coordinated operations were sentenced to long prison terms, and the victims finally began to rebuild their lives. Laws were tightened, border controls strengthened, and authorities across multiple countries were better equipped to identify signs of human trafficking. Public awareness had grown, and communities became more vigilant, determined not to let such a network operate unnoticed again. On the surface, it seemed as though justice had been served and the empire of exploitation dismantled. Yet the reality was more complex. Even with convictions and tighter regulations, new roots quietly emerged, and different faces took the roles once held by the captured leaders. Exploitation adapted to survive, shifting methods and locations, just as water finds its way around obstacles. Families continued to receive false promises from new recruiters, and victims remained vulnerable in areas where poverty and desperation prevailed. The business of exploitation had proven resilient, finding openings wherever opportunity intersected with vulnerability. The empire had not disappeared, it had evolved. The lessons of the network extended beyond the streets and borders. Investigators and social workers realized that the fight against trafficking was not only about arresting criminals, but also about addressing the root causes that allowed the crime to thrive. Poverty, lack of education, and unstable economic conditions created fertile ground for deception. Communities that had once trusted intermediaries blindly learned to question promises, verify information, and protect their young and vulnerable from those who preyed on hope. Prevention became as important as enforcement, and education campaigns were launched to inform the public about the tactics of traffickers. The victims themselves played a central role in reshaping the narrative. Many who had suffered in silence began sharing their stories publicly, turning their trauma into warnings for others. Their testimonies revealed the human cost of the crimes, exposing not only the greed and cruelty of the gangs, but also the complex psychological and social strategies used to maintain control. Their voices became powerful tools for change, influencing policy, awareness programs, and support networks for future potential victims. Despite these efforts, the untouchable boss remained missing, a lingering shadow over the justice system. His absence served as a reminder that even the most sophisticated law enforcement operations could not eliminate every threat. The empire's top figure had vanished into anonymity, proving that power could survive in the gaps between legal systems, exploiting weaknesses and adapting to enforcement measures. It was a sobering truth. The fight against organized crime was never truly complete. Ultimately, the story of the Albanian gangs became a cautionary tale about the intersection of desperation and deception. The case files closed, but the warning remained clear. Where hope exists, there is opportunity for exploitation. Crime adapts, shifts, and hides in plain sight, using human vulnerability as its currency. Society could reduce the risk, protect the vulnerable, and punish the guilty. But the threat of exploitation would persist as long as human need and ambition existed. The legacy of the network was not only in its crimes, but also in the lessons it left behind. A reminder that vigilance, education, and resilience were essential to preventing history from repeating itself.